Chapter 1, The Photograph on the Wall. The old house by the lake greeted the morning with a misty embrace. In the dimly lit study, where the air was thick with the scent of oak and aged books, Marcus stood before a wall of memories. There hung a single photograph, 5 young teenagers, tanned and grinning, arms slung around each other beneath the golden sun of a long-forgotten summer. In the background, the same lake spread out in still serenity, its surface now shrouded in an early fog that blurred the reflection of the distant trees. His fingers traced the edge of the photo frame as if trying to reach through time. That day, they'd promised each other a bond unbroken by distance, by life. Yet now, 20 years later, Marcus's grip on the glass was trembling. Somewhere in that picture, a traitor hid in plain sight. Someone who had torn his life apart and left him with questions that had festered for decades. The whiskey in his other hand sloshed gently as he brought it to his lips, the burn in his throat not nearly enough to quench the fire of unresolved betrayal. "Why now, David?" he muttered under his breath, his voice low and bitter. The news of his old friend's terminal illness had sent a ripple through his carefully ordered world. Was it pity that made him invite them all here? Or something darker, a need for answers that no amount of time could erase? He set the glass down on the heavy wooden desk, the echo sharp in the quiet room. Outside, the lake remained eerily still, as if it, too, held its breath for the storm that was about to come.
Later that afternoon, Marcus watched from the porch as the first car crunched up the gravel driveway. Liam stepped out, tall and commanding as ever, his tailored jacket and aviator sunglasses speaking of effortless wealth. Marcus noticed the way Liam hesitated, scanning the house before walking up, his confident stride betraying no hint of nerves. "Marcus," Liam greeted, his smile sharp and practiced. "Long time." "Too long," Marcus replied, the edges of his own smile not reaching his eyes. The handshake between them was firm, but not warm. Liam's cologne, rich and overpowering, lingered as he passed into the house. Marcus's gaze followed him, a flicker of something unspoken passing across his face. By evening, they were all gathered in the grand living room. Clara arrived next, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, wearing a cautious expression that Marcus couldn't help but notice. She avoided his gaze at first, but when their eyes finally met, a flicker of something, regret, guilt, passed between them. Sarah came shortly after, clutching a bottle of wine like a shield. Her smile was too wide, her laughter too loud, and Marcus could see the strain beneath her carefully crafted facade. She had always been the emotional one, but tonight, her energy seemed fragile, as though a single wrong word could send her spiraling. And then there was David. His thin frame moved slowly, his once bright eyes now clouded with the weight of illness. He leaned on Clara as they entered, and the room seemed to grow colder at the sight of him. "Thank you for this, Marcus," David said softly, his voice raw. "It means more than you know." Marcus nodded, offering a tight smile. He didn't trust his voice to speak without betraying the storm building inside him. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across their faces as they exchanged polite pleasantries. But beneath the surface, the air was thick with tension, like the stillness before lightning strikes. Marcus raised his glass. "To old friends," he said, his tone measured, his words carrying the weight of both sincerity and suspicion. "To old friends," the others echoed, their voices layered with meaning only they could understand. Chapter 2, Cracks in the Bond. The evening deepened, and the air inside the house grew heavier, thick with the ghosts of unspoken words. Marcus observed his guests as they settled into the living room, each taking a place that seemed to reflect the shifting dynamics between them. Clara sat closest to the fire, its warm light catching the tension in her clenched jaw. Sarah sprawled in a corner, pouring herself another glass of wine, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Liam leaned back in his chair, his legs crossed, his air of confidence unshaken, while David, frail and pale, remained unusually quiet beside Clara, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Marcus broke the silence with a seemingly casual question. Do you ever think about the old days? His tone was light, but the question hit the room like a thunderclap. Clara glanced sharply at Marcus, Sarah froze mid-sip, and Liam let out a short, forced laugh. All the time, Liam said, his voice smooth, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, wariness. Those were simpler times, weren't they? Simple? Sarah said with a scoff, leaning forward, her cheeks flushed. I wouldn't call them simple. Messy, maybe. David stirred, his voice raspy as he spoke. We were kids, Sarah. Kids make mistakes. Marcus tilted his head, his smile faint. Mistakes. An interesting word for what happened. The conversation moved haltingly, with every word weighed for hidden meanings. Marcus watched as Liam steered the topic toward safer territory, his recent business ventures, the success of his startups. He spoke with his usual charm, but there was a tightness in his smile that Marcus didn't miss. Real estate's a tricky game, Liam said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. You've got to be bold, take risks. Sometimes you win big, sometimes, his gaze flickered to Marcus, you lose everything. The room fell silent for a beat too long. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady when he replied, some losses aren't as random as they seem. Clara shifted in her seat, her fingers playing with the hem of her sleeve. Let's not dwell on the past, she said quickly, her tone clipped. We're here to... To what? Marcus interrupted, his voice low but cutting. To pretend? To celebrate? Clara's eyes met his, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's laughter broke the silence, brittle and too loud. Well, this is cheerful, she said, raising her glass. Here's to the past, may it stay buried where it belongs. But her hand trembled as she drank, and Marcus caught the way her eyes darted toward Clara. Something unsaid passed between the two women, and Marcus filed it away. He stood, walking to the large window that overlooked the lake. The night was pitch black, the water reflecting only the faint glow of the house. Do you remember the last time we were all here? He asked, his voice distant. That summer before college. Clara tensed visibly. Liam's face remained unreadable, but his hand gripped the arm of his chair. That was the year your dad let us take the boat out, Liam said with forced enthusiasm. And David nearly drowned trying to show off. David chuckled weakly. Some things don't change, do they, Liam? You've always been good at telling stories. The words hung in the air, their edge unmistakable. As the night wore on, the cracks in their carefully constructed facades widened. Marcus waited for the right moment, biding his time. Finally, he stood and announced, I have something for all of you. He left the room briefly, returning with a small, weathered wooden box. Setting it on the table, he opened it to reveal a collection of items, an old Polaroid, a bundle of letters tied with string, and a tarnished locket. I found these while cleaning out the attic, Marcus said, his voice calm, though his eyes burned with intensity. They brought back some interesting memories. Clara leaned forward, her brow furrowed. Where did you? Let's just say they weren't where I expected them to be, Marcus interrupted smoothly. I thought it might be fun to revisit the past. Liam glanced at the box, his expression carefully neutral, but his fingers tapped nervously against his glass. Sarah downed the rest of her wine. What's the point, Marcus? She asked, her voice sharper than intended. The point, Marcus said, his gaze sweeping the room, is that the past doesn't stay buried forever. Does it? The fire crackled in the silence that followed, its light casting long shadows on the tense faces around the room. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Past. The room was suffocating, the fire in the hearth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over the group. The old wooden box sat on the table, its contents laid bare like evidence in a courtroom. The Polaroid photograph was the first to capture everyone's attention, a snapshot of the 5 of them standing by the lake, their youthful faces carefree and smiling. What is this supposed to mean? Liam asked, his voice tight as he leaned forward to examine the picture. His finger hovered over the image but didn't touch it, as though the photo itself were a dangerous thing. It's a reminder, Marcus replied, his tone deliberately measured. Of what we used to be. Of what we promised each other. Clara reached for the locket, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it with a soft click, revealing a tiny photo inside, a much younger Marcus and Clara, their faces close, smiling as though no one else in the world existed. Clara's breath hitched. "You kept this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I found it hidden," Marcus said, his gaze locked on her. "Along with these letters." He gestured to the neatly tied bundle. Sarah drained her wine glass again, her face flushed from a mix of alcohol and anxiety. "Why are we doing this, Marcus?" she blurted. "What's the point of dragging up the past?" "The past has a way of dragging itself up," Marcus said coldly. His eyes moved to Liam. "Doesn't it?" Liam straightened, his expression hardening. "If you've got something to say, Marcus, say it. Stop playing games." Marcus leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You always liked games, didn't you, Liam? High stakes, big rewards. I wonder, how far were you willing to go to win back then?" "What the hell are you talking about?" Liam shot back, his voice rising. "I'm talking about trust," Marcus replied, his voice sharp. "And how easily it's broken. You think I don't remember that summer? The way you always seemed to know exactly when to strike? Or how my career fell apart right as yours took off?" Clara's eyes darted between them, wide with alarm. "Marcus, stop this," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't fair." "Fair?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising for the first time. "What wasn't fair was being blindsided, betrayed, and left to pick up the pieces while someone else profited from my downfall." Liam slammed his glass down on the table, the sharp sound echoing through the room. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Before Marcus could respond, Sarah let out a sharp laugh, the sound brittle and unnerving. "We're all liars, aren't we?" she said, her words slurring slightly. "Every single one of us. We've all done things we're not proud of. So why don't we stop pretending anyone here is innocent?" Her gaze swept the room, landing on Clara. "Like you, Clara. Do you think we didn't notice the way you disappear with Marcus that summer? And then suddenly, you're with David. Convenient, isn't it?" Clara's face paled, and she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You don't know what you're talking about, Sarah." "Don't I?" Sarah challenged, rising unsteadily to her feet. "I was there, Clara. I saw you. And I saw what happened after." David's voice cut through the rising tension, low and hoarse. "That's enough." All eyes turned to him as he pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on the back of his chair. "We're here because of me," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "I'm the one who's dying. And I won't spend my last days watching us tear each other apart over things we can't change." The room fell silent, David's words lingering in the air. Marcus took a deep breath, the fire in his eyes dimming slightly. "You're right, David. We can't change the past. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't face it." He picked up one of the letters, holding it up for everyone to see. "This was written to me the week my career collapsed. It warned me about a setup, about someone using me as a scapegoat. And it came from one of you." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "Marcus, Save it," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "I'll get my answers, one way or another. Tonight, no more lies. No more secrets." The fire crackled behind him, the shadows on the wall seeming to grow darker and more menacing. Chapter 4, Masks Removed. The fire's flickering light carved jagged shadows on the walls, as if the house itself was reacting to the storm brewing within its walls. The group sat in taut silence, their eyes darting to the objects on the table and then back to Marcus, who loomed like a judge over a courtroom of guilty defendants. Marcus leaned forward, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. "This," he said, his voice low and cutting, "is from someone who cared enough to warn me. Someone who knew what was happening but didn't want to risk being caught in the fallout. It says enough to point fingers, but not enough to save me. Why didn't they just tell me the truth?" He looked directly at Clara. She flinched under his gaze, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I didn't know what to do," she whispered. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Of course, it was you," she slurred, her wineglass teetering dangerously in her hand. "The perfect Clara. Always so pure, so innocent." "Shut up, Sarah!" Clara snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "No, let her talk," Marcus interjected coldly. "I'm curious. What else does Sarah know?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a sardonic smile. "I know that Clara was with you that summer, Marcus. Sneaking around, acting like no one noticed. And then suddenly, she's with David. Funny how that worked out, isn't it?" Clara's face turned crimson as she stood, fists clenched. "You don't know the first thing about what happened, Sarah. I loved Marcus, but David found out. He threatened to ruin me, to tell everyone and destroy my reputation. I didn't have a choice." "Didn't have a choice?" Marcus's voice rose, his anger finally breaking free. "You could have told me. Instead, you chose him. You let me think I wasn't enough, that I wasn't worth fighting for." Clara's tears spilled over, but before she could respond, David spoke, his voice rasping and weak but filled with venom. "Don't blame her for my decisions," he said, his hollow eyes fixed on Marcus. "She did what she had to do. And I did what I had to do. You were always the golden boy, Marcus. The one everyone admired, the one who got everything handed to him. I just leveled the playing field."
Marcus stared at David, his jaw tightening. "You're admitting it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the one who set me up. Who let me take the fall." David smirked faintly, his illness dulling none of his malice. "You had it coming. All those years of being perfect, of being untouchable. You needed a reality check. And I gave it to you." Liam's voice cut in, sharp and defensive. "Hold on. You're telling me you're the one behind all this?" "I thought," he hesitated, glancing at Marcus. "You thought what, Liam?" Marcus asked, his tone icy. Liam's facade finally cracked. "I thought it was me, all right," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I knew your failure would give me an opening in business, and I took it. I didn't sabotage you, but I didn't stop it either. I capitalized on it. And yeah, I've regretted it ever since." Marcus's glare shifted from David to Liam, his fury barely contained. "So, you're both guilty. One of you destroyed my career out of spite, and the other profited from the wreckage. How does that make you feel, Liam? Knowing you benefited from David's betrayal?" Liam looked away, his silence louder than any excuse he could have given. Sarah, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke, her voice low and raw. "And what about me?" she said, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I saw it all happening. I knew what David was doing, and I knew Liam wasn't innocent either. But I said nothing. I didn't warn you, Marcus, because I was too afraid of being dragged into it. So maybe I'm the worst of all of us." Her confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning any chance of reconciliation. Marcus stood, his hands gripping the back of his chair as he looked at each of them in turn. "You're all complicit," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "Every single one of you. And you left me to pick up the pieces of a life you shattered. For what? Jealousy? Greed? Fear?" Clara sobbed quietly into her hands. Liam stared at the floor, his jaw tight. Sarah downed the last of her wine and sank further into her chair. David simply smirked, the flames from the fireplace reflecting in his hollow eyes. "I wanted this weekend to give me closure," Marcus continued, his voice growing steadier. "But all it's done is show me how broken we all are. We were supposed to be friends. We were supposed to protect each other. Instead, we destroyed each other." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, each of them retreating into their own thoughts. The room felt colder, darker, as though the truth had drained it of all warmth. And yet, deep within Marcus, something shifted. The anger that had driven him for so long began to give way to something else, an aching, hollow sadness. "Maybe this is what we deserve," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Maybe this is the price of betrayal." He turned and walked toward the window, staring out at the dark lake. Behind him, the others sat in stunned silence, their faces etched with guilt, regret, and something close to fear. Chapter 5, The Breaking Point. The dawn broke over the lake, a pale, ghostly light washing over the house as if nature itself sought to cleanse the darkness that had unfolded inside. The group gathered in the kitchen, the air heavy with exhaustion and the weight of the previous night's revelations. No one spoke as they sipped their coffee, the silence punctuated only by the faint creaks of the old house and the distant call of a loon on the lake. Marcus stood apart from them, leaning against the counter, his eyes fixed on the window. The lake's surface was eerily still, reflecting the cloudy sky above. He turned slowly, his face calm, though his eyes carried the burden of too many emotions to name. "This is it," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "The end of this, whatever this was." Clara looked up at him, her expression pleading. "Marcus, we can't just leave things like this. We have to." "To what?" he interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. "Fix it? There's nothing left to fix, Clara. You all made sure of that."
Liam cleared his throat, his usual confidence replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. "Look, I know I screwed up, Marcus. We all did. But maybe we can start over. Let the past go." Marcus laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Let the past go? Easy for you to say, Liam. You're not the one who lost everything. You got richer, stronger, more successful. While I had to rebuild my life from the ground up." Sarah, her voice raw from too much wine and too little sleep, spoke up. "He's right," she said. "We don't get to ask for forgiveness, not after what we did. We're not those kids in the photograph anymore. We've all changed, and not for the better." Her words hung in the air like a funeral bell, marking the death of whatever connection had once held them together. David, slumped in his chair, coughed weakly. His voice, when it came, was raspier than ever. "So that's it, then? We just walk away?" Marcus turned to him, his jaw tightening. "Yes, David. That's exactly what we do. We walk away and live with what we've done. You've already taken so much from me. I won't let you take anything more." Clara wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. "I didn't want this to happen. Any of it. I loved you, Marcus. I still..." "Don't," Marcus said, cutting her off. "Don't say it. Whatever we had, it's gone. You made your choice." The finality in his words seemed to drain the fight from her. She sank back into her chair, silent tears streaming down her face.
As the hours crept by, The group slowly began to scatter. Liam was the first to leave, his usual swagger absent as he carried his bag to his car. He paused briefly at the door, glancing back at Marcus as if searching for some form of absolution. Marcus said nothing, and Liam turned away, disappearing down the driveway. Sarah left next, offering no goodbyes. Her steps were unsteady, and as she climbed into her car, she looked back at the house with an expression of quiet despair. Clara lingered the longest, standing by the lake with her arms wrapped around herself. Marcus watched her from the porch, but he didn't approach. When she finally turned and walked toward her car, she stopped briefly in front of him. "Goodbye, Marcus," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Goodbye, Clara," he replied, his tone devoid of emotion. Only David remained. He sat on the porch, staring out at the lake as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Marcus joined him, the two men sitting in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, David spoke, his voice low and filled with regret. "You hate me. I get it. You probably always will." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stared at the horizon, his face unreadable. "Maybe I will," he said at last. "Or maybe I'll just forget you. That might be worse." David nodded, his expression hollow. "Maybe I deserve that." When David finally left, the house felt unbearably quiet. Marcus stood on the porch, watching his old friend's car disappear down the long, winding road.
Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.